Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Raphel, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia in the mid-90s. Still considers India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the region, her stomping ground. Now lives in Washington, D.C. Robin, welcome to ThePrint. You're a household name in India, at least.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be with you. Really, very nice to see you.
And we are in Herat in Afghanistan because somehow we don't seem to meet in Delhi because of, several reasons. So it's very nice to meet you here. Tell me, my first question to you, Robin, is about the situation today here in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And of course, your country, the US, has a very strong role and an influence. What does the US want to do?
The U.S. has decided, and I believe correctly, that there's no military solution here in Afghanistan. And so we're very keen on getting a political settlement, getting negotiations going with the hope of bringing an end to this 40 years of war.
What do you mean by a political settlement?
Well, the U.S. right now, as you know, has been talking to the Taliban. The talks are stalled at the moment, but the whole idea was for the U.S. and the Taliban to come to an agreement on a schedule for troop withdrawal in exchange for counterterrorism assurances and an inter-Afghan dialogue.
Right.
And that was to set the stage for the real peace negotiation among Afghans. And we would like to see that start as soon as possible.
So what happened? Why did President Trump cancel the meeting at Camp David a few weeks ago?
I don't want to speculate because I really don't know, but I think it wasn't quite coming together at the end. There were too many loose ends and the date was approaching, so he put it off.
Because some say that Zalmay Khalilzad, the special envoy, wanted the signature to be done before the Taliban met at Camp David, and the Taliban also wanted the same.
I think that's correct. But there was also a lot of concern in Washington about the symbolism of such a meeting at Camp David, which is an iconic place in America, and on the eve of 9/11 anniversary. So I think all things combined to have the president cancel it.
And you thought that was a good idea for him to cancel?
Well, I never thought that the Camp David scenario was very good.
Okay.
No.
But you're saying that the talks are back on the table?
I believe so. I think there have been informal meetings, and I think every effort's being made to not to lose momentum in the process and get it going again.
So tell us about the sequencing. How does this work? Do you have a ceasefire first and then the dialogue? How does it work?
Well, Ambassador Khalilzad said at the beginning there are 4 elements to this. Troop withdrawal schedule, counterterrorism assurances, intra-Afghan dialogue, and a ceasefire. There was no particular sequence at that time, and he was saying nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. But he found in the whole process over the last year that he had to split it up. Mm-hmm. So counterterrorism assurances and the troop withdrawal schedule, and then the inter-Afghan dialogue and ceasefire in 2 separate parts. It's not that they're not related. They certainly are, but he had to sequence it that way.
Okay. And how are the Pakistanis helping the Americans on this?
Pakistanis have been very helpful in signaling to the Taliban, in logistics and so on. And I think, as far as we can tell, the Pakistanis have been quite serious about this negotiation because for the first time the U.S. has been really serious about a negotiated settlement.
So what are when you say that the Pakistanis are serious, what does that mean?
That means that they're willing to help and that they're looking, forward as to how they will comport themselves vis-a-vis Afghanistan in the future.
But they know Afghanistan so well. The Quetta Shura is in Pakistan, as is in Karachi. A lot of Taliban live there.
Right. No. They certainly know Afghanistan well. Sometimes I would argue they don't know Afghanistan as well as they think they do. But I think we're all pulling in the same direction. They're not going to send all the Taliban home, overnight or anything like that. But we're pulling in the same direction.
So when you say that they don't know the Taliban as well as they think they do, what does that mean?
I think when you look back historically after the Soviets left, I think that the Pakistanis were a bit too self-confident and mishandled things. That is my view. In taking the Mujahideen and using them as proxies in Kashmir, for example, and that kind of thing, and not realizing that in time that would come back to haunt them in their own home ground.
Explain that to us a little bit, because the early 90s in India, especially in Kashmir, is not just a memory, it's a living presence. It's something that we live with every day, even today in Kashmir.
Yeah, no, I think, well, first of all, I will say that the Pakistanis wouldn't have had any effect in Kashmir if the Kashmiris hadn't already been frustrated by the way Indians were handling things in Kashmir. So this, the insurrection in Kashmir was not caused by Pakistan, in my view.
This is in the early 90s.
Yeah, but they took advantage and stirred the pot, which wasn't very smart. It wasn't very long, because ultimately you had it resulted in these kinds of groups hanging around, being around, and they eventually, for a combination of reasons, turned on the Pakistani state. So they hadn't been there, it wouldn't have happened that way.
And at the same time, they were creating the Taliban in Quetta, in Miramshah, and in various...
Well, I wouldn't say they were creating the Taliban. I would say they were supporting a nascent movement, anti-warlord movement in Afghanistan.
Right. And at the time, of course, there were only 3 countries that were supporting Taliban Afghanistan, including Pakistan. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
Yeah, right. That's after the Taliban got to Kabul, but the support had begun before then.
Do you think the Pakistanis recognize what they did at the time, or to me it seems like history is repeating itself today?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think the opposite. I think the Pakistanis are very keen now on a stable Afghanistan. They have all their own problems with the economy and so on. And their top preference is a stable Afghanistan, I believe. I mean, you'd have to ask them, but that's the way I see it.
So are they using their proxies? After all, Mullah Baradar, the Taliban leader, has been in a Pakistani jail for 9 or 10 years.
Well, we asked for him to be released, and he was released and has been a very key interlocutor in these talks with Ambassador Khalilzad. I think one has to be careful with this term proxy, in the sense that it's not just Pakistan that uses proxies in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Many countries use proxies. So it's not like this is some particular evil that the Pakistanis have invented.
Like which other countries would use proxies?
Oh, I would say, what about the United States of America? We use proxies in Syria and other places. So it's a form of warfare, that is commonly used.
So would that include, what would a proxy mean? Would that include arming them, supporting them with weapons?
A lot of, it all depends. But I'm just making the point that in any asymmetric situation, or a situation where you don't want to get directly involved. When the Soviets were in Afghanistan, the U.S. didn't want to directly take them on.
Right.
So we worked through Pakistan, our money, Saudi money, and so on and so forth. So that's a proxy situation, not uncommon.
Right. So here in Herat at this conference, we've been hearing a lot of criticism about Pakistan. Is that they play a role that is not a good one?
Look, it's very natural, I think, for Afghans, to be negative about Pakistan. It's their larger neighbor. They feel taken advantage of, and I think used to a certain extent, especially in the 90s and so on, and continuing on. So that rivalry is very natural. Mm-hmm. And I think, sometimes countries like people don't fully understand one another.
Right. But this kind of negativity, they talk openly about the ISI and the establishment pushing, the Pakistani Taliban into Afghanistan and sort of creating...
Look, a lot of times countries like individuals don't take as much responsibility as they should for their own problems. The Taliban didn't flourish here just because of Pakistan, or even primarily because of Pakistan. It was more because the situation here was ripe. And more recently, with corruption and poor governance and all of these understandable struggles. I mean, this is a relatively new state coming, after the defeat of the Soviet Union. So it's understandable, but it's still a problem. So, it's not all outsiders' fault.
Right. And today in Afghanistan, how do you look at the situation? Again, there's so much talk about bad governance, corruption. Where do you see it heading? Do you think that the Taliban are coming back?
Look, I like to see the glasses half full. I think there's an opportunity for a serious peace process because, number one, people are tired of war. But number two, there isn't a victory. There's not a victory for the Taliban, and there's not a victory on the battlefield for the United States and its Afghan allies. And everybody realizes that. So what do you do then? You talk, you negotiate. And I think there's just a lot more sober awareness that that's the only option and that the people want it. So I'm hopeful it will go forward in that direction.
The Afghans also being very critical of the U.S., saying that they want to get out no matter what and leave us in the lurch, as it were.
Well, the Afghans have got to take some responsibility for their own situation. Now, as an American, of course, I don't want a cut-and-run situation here. I don't want any of us to wake up one morning and find that U.S. troops have been ordered out. I don't want that. I think a responsible, phased, conditional withdrawal is certainly the way that it needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But we're not accomplishing much here on the battlefield except killing Afghans. And, I think enough is enough of that.
So Trump will get out no matter what, say, in the next year, before your election?
Well, first of all, he wants out. There's no doubt about that. He's made that absolutely clear, and, we, at our peril, ignore that. But I think it'll take longer than a year. We have a lot of troops and equipment here, and it'll take longer than that, I would judge, unless, something unusual, a tweet drops from the sky.
Right. But the Americans seem to be very dependent on the Pakistanis.
Well, they are in the sense of the ground lines of communication, shipping equipment through Pakistan and so on, and flying over Pakistani airspace, yes.
But even in terms of the negotiations, the criticism that, they don't talk directly to the Afghans and that they must go through the Pakistanis who then use their proxies.
Oh, no, they do talk directly to the Afghans. Ambassador Khalilzad's negotiations started in Doha.
But Camp David was getting the Taliban over to Camp David and Ashraf Ghani separately and then putting them on the table and say, okay, talk.
Right, but it wasn't about Pakistan. That was about inviting the Taliban and Ashraf Ghani at the same time, which to those people...
The Pakistanis were going to tell the Taliban to get there.
No, the Taliban, I think, would have come if they'd had the agreement. That was the key.
And what would that agreement be?
I don't know the details. I haven't seen the text. But basically, it is a troop withdrawal timetable in exchange for counterterrorism assurances and an agreement to sit down with the Afghan government.
Okay, and ceasefire comes last.
And the ceasefire coming in first on the agenda of the intra-Afghan talks.
Do you feel, Robin, that with Kashmir, for example, again, the Pakistanis are talking about this, Imran Khan is supposed to have told Trump this in the U.S. a couple of weeks ago, that the Indians have to, that the situation in Kashmir will have a role to play in the Pakistan-Afghanistan.
I think what they really meant, and the Kashmir announcement had just been made and everybody was quite riled up. I think they were saying they can't focus on both borders at the same time and that they may have to move some troops from the west to the east and that it would dilute their focus. I think they subsequently aren't talking that way.
Okay, and are the Americans buying into that?
Well, the Americans are saying, and quite rightly, that these really are separate. issues, very separate issues. And the American government is certainly saying, we expect you to continue to support us in the peace process in Afghanistan. That's a top priority, and it's, of course, in Pakistan's interest as well as ours.
So what is the view in the U.S. regarding Kashmir? Infamously or famously, shall I say, we all remember your statement in the 90s when you talked about the instrument of accession not being accepted by the U.S.
I think the point there was very simple. Yeah. Kashmir is disputed. It doesn't matter whether there are UN resolutions, whether there's the Lahore Declaration, whether there's Simla, whether there's an instrument of accession. The point is that people don't agree. Stakeholders don't agree on the status of Kashmir. Kashmiris don't agree on the status of Kashmir. So it's a dispute. It needs to be resolved. And that was our view then, and I think that's the view now. It's not sustainable what's going on there now. So somehow the Indian government needs to engage with the Kashmiris, and they need to find valid interlocutors and a way forward.
But the question of the instrument of accession that then Maharaja Hari Singh signed, are you still disputing that? Do you see?
Yeah, whether it exists, that was never the point.
Okay.
That was never the point. Okay. The point was it didn't settle anything.
Right. So you felt misunderstood at the
time? Very misunderstood. Very misunderstood.
Right. And what's the view in the U.S. On Kashmir today? Do you think we should reach out, that the Indian government should reach out much more to the Kashmiris?
Well, yeah, the view is that the human rights situation is pretty appalling. That is the view, and it's becoming more and more apparent in the U.S. Congress that is the view. So I think, yes, the Indian government does need to loosen up, and I appreciate in order to do that, they need to find interlocutors. They need to reach out to the Kashmiris.
Right. But as of with the U.S. Congress has been quite critical, especially in recent weeks. But Trump seems to be still supportive of the Modi government.
Well, look, governments and their policies sometimes, and countries and their governments sometimes are separate things. India is a very important country to the United States. Emerging global power, large economy, growing military, market for many of our products. It's a very important country to the United States. So we're not going to turn on a dime because of this situation. But it's very clear that the Indian government does need to reach out to the Kashmiris.
Much more.
Much more, yeah.
So let me bring you back to Afghanistan. How does the U.S. see India's role in Afghanistan?
Well, in our view, India has been quite constructive here with its economic development assistance. And I think, as Ambassador Rakesh Sood said yesterday, the idea of supporting institutions rather than individuals is quite important.
But does that feed into the Pakistani narrative that India should actually stay out?
Well, it's not quite, India has a role here as in any of the neighbors, and again has been being quite constructive in terms of development. So, I don't think that they should stay completely out. I don't think that that's a view that's shared in the U.S.
Because I remember in the early 2000s after 9/11, and of course that was, almost 20 years ago, 19 years ago, where the Americans did not want India to open consulates in the south, in Kandahar, and elsewhere. So,
well,
things have changed.
No. I think, as you know, for a long time there was a rumor that the Indians had 20 consulates around and so on and so forth.
Just 4.
Okay, I'm just saying there was a rumor that they had 20 all over the country, and that was disconcerting. It was,
Why? Why was it disconcerting?
Because they didn't. It wasn't true, but as a rumor.
Just the 4 consulates or a couple.
4 consulates, a couple in the south. But look, the temptation of any country to meddle in the affairs of others is a persistent feature of human nature and relations between states. And the U.S. view had been, this is a very delicate situation. It was for us after 9/11. Let's not do anything to provoke further controversy here.
Right. But today, India and the U.S., you think, can together do, work in Afghanistan?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. it would be nice if Pakistan and India would work together in Afghanistan, in my view.
The Pakistanis would certainly not like a U.S. and India coming together in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, working together, there are development projects, there are ways to work together that don't threaten anybody's interests.
Right. But if India and Afghanistan have a much closer strategic partnership, in terms of defense or even, maybe like ammunition, that kind of thing, what would the U.S. say?
Well, the U.S. has tried very hard to dehyphenate this relationship, and we always find that one country or the other is rehyphenating it. But I think they're quite separate. We have our relations with India, we have our relations with Pakistan. Both are important countries. One sometimes forgets, since India is so overwhelmingly large, that Pakistan is one of the largest countries in the world as well. So we need to have good relations with both. We need to strive for good relations with both.
But a closer strategic partnership between India and Afghanistan, would the U.S. be, what would your view be?
Look, I think every country needs to be mindful, for their own interests over the effect of their relations with other countries on their neighbors.
Right.
It's a simple formula.
Last couple of questions, Robin. I know you have to go. What happens once these negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban conclude? How do you envisage a power-sharing agreement in Kabul?
That is going to be up to the Afghans. And the whole object of the exercise here is to get the Afghans to the table, that this agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, should it transpire, is an enabler to start that key negotiation.
And you feel that these negotiations will be back sooner than later, will be back on the table sooner?
I hope so.
Robin Raphel, thank you so much for speaking to ThePrint. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
This is Jyoti Malhotra for ThePrint in Herat, Afghanistan. Please continue to watch our YouTube channel. It's live and buzzing.